Welcome to the first Power Hour of the year. We're glad you could be with us this morning, and as always, we're looking forward to another great Power Hour. As we begin, a quick reminder that Chamber Restaurant Week is just around the corner, running from January 25th to February the 1st. And last year, over 75 restaurants participated, and at chamberrestaurantweek.com saw more than 70,000 visits of people looking at menus and searching the Chamber Restaurant Week deals. It's a major hit every year, and so we took that, and building upon that success, we've also launched our first ever Chamber Wellness Week, happening in 3 days, kicking off on January the 11th through the 18th. And so this Saturday at the Tiki Hut, the beach house, we'll be doing the Chamber Waves to Wellness 5K. And like I mentioned, it'll be at the Tiki Hut Beach House. You don't want to miss it, and you can certainly sign up for that online. A big thank you to our title sponsors, Novant Health, Encompass Health, the Fromm Center, and Healthy Habit. Without them, Chamber Wellness Week wouldn't be happening, and we're so thankful for their participation. Also, a shout out to Al Olivetti and Hilton Head Running Company for coordinating the race. For details on all the wellness deals and activities at Chamber Wellness Week, you can go to chamberwellnessweek.com. So let's get started with today's lineup. We have another impressive group to share insights on what's in store for our regional economy, when beach renourishment is happening on Hilton Head Island and how that's going to impact your time at the beach. And of course, Buc-ee's, what's happening with the famous spot coming to the Low Country. As we go along, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll certainly be glad to ask those with as long as time permits. Well, our first guest today is certainly not a stranger to many, Dr. Joey Von Nessen. He's a research economist at USC's Darla Moore School of Business. Dr. Von Nessen specializes in regional economics forecasting and housing trends, as well as his expertise is sought after day by day with organizations like Michelin, Boeing, and many, many others. You know, the great state of South Carolina is one of the top 3 states people are relocating to, and the population growth has a big impact on our local and regional and state economies. And here to share his thoughts and research what's in store for us in 2025 for South Carolina's economy and what it's going to mean for our region is our friend, Dr. Von Nessen. Dr. Von Nessen, thank you for being with us today, and we're delighted to have you.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's my pleasure. It's great to be with everyone this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick, and hopefully everybody can see that. And Happy New Year to everyone. Happy 2025. I know we've got a packed agenda this morning, so I will jump right into our 2025 South Carolina Economic Outlook. And again, thank you all for being here and for inviting me to participate with you this morning. So as we talk about where we are in early 2025, as we look ahead to this year in terms of what our expectations are for the future, I think it's important to step back and look at 3 methods of evaluation. And so this morning, over the next few minutes, I want to talk through economic perception, just how people feel about the economy in early 2025, economic performance, what do the metrics actually show us, and then economic expectations, what are our expectations about the future? So perception, performance, and expectations. So let's start with perception. Just how do people feel about the South Carolina and U.S. economies in January of 2025? And the short answer to this question is not good. That's the reality. And we can see that in a number of different ways, but the easiest way to see that is to just look at consumer confidence. So if we look back over the last several years, consumer confidence is still fairly low compared to where it was before the pandemic began back in December of 2019. If we look on the eve of the pandemic and compare consumer confidence today, it is still substantially lower. It has been improving over the last several years, and especially since the latter half of 2022 and into 2023, and certainly over the last year as well. It has continually improved, but still well below where it was before the pandemic. And this sets up a bit of a quandary because we have also seen at the same time very stable and steady levels of consumer spending, which is the bulk of economic activity in South Carolina and the US. And that begs the question as to why. Why is it the case that consumer confidence tends to be fairly low? Our economic perception is low, but consumer spending has been fairly stable overall. And the reason actually comes down to looking at the types of groups that have been driving that spending across the US and in South Carolina. And we can see that here if we look at total growth rates in retail spending, which is a proxy for overall consumer spending, but we actually break it down by household income group into what we call low, middle, and high income households. And what you'll notice here is that since 2021, the bulk of the growth in retail spending has come from high income groups in the United States. That green line there, it's the only line that's been consistently above that flat black line, which represents the rate of spending that we were seeing back in July of 2021, right when inflation began to take off. So as inflation increased, the only group that was really continuing to grow in their spending activity were these high income households. And those high income households collectively only represent about 35% of the US population. So what does that mean? It means that the majority of the US population has not been increasing their overall spending levels. They've been either steady or pulling back a bit, again, looking at the red and the blue lines there. And so it's no surprise then that if we have consumer spending that's remained stable over time, and we've seen steady growth, if that spending activity is mainly coming from these high income groups that only represents about 35% of the country, then what's going on with the other two groups? What's going on with the remaining 65%? Well, they've lost purchasing power because of high inflation and haven't been able to continue to spend as much as they had been. And so that's where we're seeing that loss in consumer confidence. So steady rates of consumer spending, but it's primarily driven by these higher income household groups. And as a result, that does not represent the bulk of the population. And that's why we've seen a pullback in, or rather low consumer confidence, despite the fact that consumer spending overall, on average, has been fairly steady over time. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that consumers are beginning to claw back that lost purchasing power across all income groups. And this is a new trend that we've seen emerge in 2024 that has been consistent and very stable, which you can see here. If we just compare overall wage growth in the United States and we compare that directly to inflation, what you'll notice is that throughout 2024, we've seen that wage growth has outpaced inflation and by a significant amount. Here you can see 4% is the current annual wage growth for the United States, and our current inflation rate right at 2.7%. So wages are growing faster than inflation, meaning that even though consumers have lost purchasing power over the last several years, they have begun to claw it back. And we anticipate that this will continue into 2025. And if we continue to see wage growth and inflation at comparable levels throughout this year, then on average, what we expect is for consumers to claw back and recover all of the lost purchasing power that was lost over the last several years since 2021. And that's very good news, because the more we see consumers regain that lost purchasing power, the more likely we'll be able to see consumer spending as a whole continue at its current rate, which means more stable economic growth for 2025. Because again, consumer spending represents the bulk of economic activity in the United States. So that gives us a sense of economic perception. Again, improving, but still down compared to where we were before the pandemic, simply because of that loss in purchasing power that most consumers have experienced, most households, and that they're continuing and still recovering from. They are clawing back as we move into 2025. So what can we say about economic performance then, the second metric that we want to look at, or the second factor for evaluating our economy? Well, it turns out economic performance has been much stronger. If we look more broadly across most metrics in the US economy, we can evaluate the economy and give it a grade And when we look at most metrics, we would give the economy a grade of B plus, a grade of B plus, meaning that by most metrics, the economy continues to perform well. This has been true throughout 2024 and is true going into 2025. As I mentioned, we've seen steady rates of consumer spending as a whole. We've seen very low unemployment across the US, historically low unemployment in South Carolina. And as I mentioned, very steady wage gains that have been higher than inflation. So by most metrics, the economy continues to perform well, but we can't give ourselves an A. We have to go with that B plus because again, most consumers have lost significant purchasing power that they are still clawing back as we start the new year. The other factor that we're seeing right now in terms of the overall performance is that we've begun to see a cooling of the economy as a whole, particularly with respect to labor markets. This has been true in 2024. But even with this cooling, it's still a positive development because it represents a new era that we are moving into in 2025. And this is a real key point about a difference that we are likely to see this year compared to last year in 2024. That is, we're finally moving away from what I would call a pandemic bubble and towards more sustainable growth rates in the new year. Going back to 2020 and 2021, remember that we saw a rapid recovery, but much of that was due to $6 trillion in fiscal stimulus. And that led to very high levels of demand and was a major cause of the inflation that we've seen over the last several years and generated effectively a pandemic bubble that we have been adjusting away from. And again, we are moving into more sustainable rates of growth in 2025. And a good way to see this, I think a really good way to encapsulate what we've been experiencing is to just compare the recovery that we've seen from the COVID pandemic recession in 2020 to the Great Recession back in 2008. So if we just compare the two directly, what you'll find is that in 2008, it took us almost 7 years to recover all the lost jobs that we lost in 2008 following the financial crash, about 7 years. Contrast that to the COVID recession, where it took us about 2 years to recover all the lost jobs. So a major difference, right? 7 years versus about 2 years. So clearly 2 years is better than 7, but we also paid a price for it in the form of higher inflation. Because how did we accelerate the economy so quickly? We injected that $6 trillion of stimulus that led to higher rates of inflation and a loss of purchasing power. So when we think about recovery from a recession, we have to consider not only recovering all the lost jobs, but also recovering all of that lost purchasing power. And it's that latter piece that we haven't yet recovered following the 2020 recession, but it's something that we are likely to recover in 2025 if we continue to see the strong wage gains and the lower inflation that have emerged in 2024. So that's very good news as we're moving forward. We can look ahead and see that we are likely to move from a recovery phase of our economy to a genuine expansion in 2025. That is moving away from a pandemic bubble and more towards sustainable rates of growth overall. And we can especially see this if we look at consumer spending patterns and the differences in the goods and the services sector. And you can see very clearly the goods bubble that emerged in 2020, again, following that $6 trillion in stimulus those dollars were spent in the local economy, spent by consumers, but all going into the goods market, right? Because we were socially distanced back in 2020 and 21. We weren't going out to eat. We certainly weren't getting on an airplane, but we were spending it in the goods market. So you can see that goods bubble peak in 2021 and then begin to taper. And then just in the last 6 months or so, have we finally seen that pendulum swing back to a more stable relationship between spending on goods and services. In other words, that goods bubble now, that pandemic bubble, has mostly deflated. And this has also been very good news for the Hilton Head market as we see consumer spending shift back towards the services sector because a bulk of the growth in the Hilton Head market comes from retail and tourism. So that has seen a major has had a both sectors have had a tailwind over the last year, so that's been good news. In addition to healthcare demand, really driving Hilton Head market, the Hilton Head market, because we see so much more growth in the area, more people moving in, generating a higher demand for healthcare related services. So what can we say about the labor market? A very similar picture. As I mentioned, the labor market has been cooling. This is very easy to see if we look at South Carolina's unemployment rate, which has increased from 3%, 3.0% to 4.8% between January and November of 2024, which again looks alarming on the surface, but we have to remember that this is part of that adjustment away from the pandemic bubble and towards more sustainable rates of growth that we're likely to see in 2025. And in fact, unemployment is rising not because of new layoff activity, but rather just because of slower job growth. Not because of increased layoff activity, but because of slower job growth. And you can see that very clearly, again, in the data. If we look at South Carolina employment growth and just look at growth patterns going all the way back to 2021, you can see that in the last year and in the last 2 years, really, we've seen a pullback from about 4% employment growth on average per year to about 3%, which is still very healthy, still very strong, but again, not as strong as we've seen in the last several years. And I would suggest to you that we can think about the labor market right now as moving from an excessively tight labor market to a tight labor market. So we're moving from a red hot level of demand to more sustainable growth, moving away from that pandemic bubble towards sustainable growth in 2025. So this uptick in the unemployment rate, again, at first glance, it's alarming, but when we look in context, this is actually about where we want to be, because the unemployment rate at about 5 to 6% is typically what we see in South Carolina during periods of economic expansions, normal economic expansions that we saw before the pandemic began. All right, so let's move on to economic expectations. So we've talked about perception, we've talked about performance, again at a B+ level. Fairly strong economic performance overall, despite the fact that perceptions have been fairly low. And as we look ahead for economic expectations for 2025, we can ask a simple question of what this implies for the rest of the year. As we look ahead, what do these trends imply about the year ahead? And there are 2 points that I want to leave you with this morning. Number one is that we are more optimistic that we will avoid recession in 2025. So we expect a lower risk for recession. That's the good news. But the bad news is we anticipate that there's a higher risk for inflation rebounding. So we anticipate that it's likely that we may see inflation begin to tick back up. So let's just spend a couple of minutes talking about each one of these points before we wrap up. So first, the lower likelihood of recession. That's really the good news. And how can we see that for 2025? The simple way is to go through a recession checklist. We can look at all of the major variables that are influencing and that measure economic health at the state and the national level. And these are broad-based measures. These also include all of the measures that the NBER utilizes, the National Bureau of Economic Research. They're the organization that actually officially defines when a recession is in the United States. So it's important to look at their checklist as well. So these factors encompass the NBER's checklist. But we can just go through and see where there are any red flags. And you can see we break it down into consumer and business activity as well as the market environment. We've talked about consumer spending and job growth already. Consumer spending very stable, job growth still very healthy, even though we've seen a bit of a slowdown more towards a sustainable level of labor demand. And we don't have time to go through each one of these measures, but the bottom line here is that we don't see any red flags on the horizon, regardless of whether we're looking at consumer spending or consumer debt levels, personal income, as you see, industrial production, manufacturing, and trade sales. All of these measures look very stable overall. And then when we add to that, the market environment, factors that are influencing the broader market, here we see positive news as well. As I mentioned, the deflated goods bubble, meaning that we've gone through that correction period following a pandemic bubble. We've seen that deflation. which means we can begin to see growth in the goods sector in 2025. And we're also experiencing some stimulative effect resulting from lower interest rates. So again, looking at our recession checklist, all measures look fairly strong, not really any major red flags on the horizon at this time. So that's the good news, lower risk for recession. The bad news, as I mentioned, though, still a higher risk for inflation rebounding in 2025. And this is really the biggest single risk factor for our economy this year. And we can see inflation, this just tracks it back to 2014 to give you a sense of how it's been ebbing and flowing over time. You can see inflation peaking at 9.1%. It falls to 3.1% in 2023, but has really bounced around at between 2.5% and 3% since then over the last year. And that begs the question of why? Why is it stuck at between 2.5% and 3%? And will we be able to get inflation down to the Federal Reserve's target of 2.0%? And what is it that's keeping it at about 2.5%? Well, if we ask that question, we can say, well, what got us to 3% in the first place? In other words, why did we see this major decline in inflation from 9% to 3%? And it turns out the bulk of the reason for that pullback has been a decline or a pullback in housing costs, or what we call shelter costs, officially from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But the bottom line here is that when interest rates began to rise in 2022, that helped to taper housing demand. And while it didn't cause house prices to go down, it did cause them not to go up by as much. So when you see here shelter costs coming down, all that means is that they're not going up by as much as they were previously. But every number here is above zero. It's just not as high as it was. So we're seeing housing costs taper, not going up as much as they were before. And so as a result, that has been helping to pull inflation down from about 9% to 3%. But you can also see that housing costs have really stabilized, right? They haven't been coming down as much in recent months, which begs the question as to whether we're going to see any other factor that can help pull inflation down in 2025, because it looks like it's not going to be housing. Again, housing costs have really stabilized. So how do we get down to 2% inflation in 2025? And the answer is it's going to be tough, because there are a lot of factors that are fighting the Fed this year. And again, we don't have time to go through all of them this morning, but the bottom line, again, is that if we look across the economy, there are just a lot of factors that are either keeping prices at their current levels or are pushing prices up. And this doesn't take into account any new factors that might be fighting the Fed in 2025, namely new tariff activity, which might take place in 2025. So again, a lot of factors here fighting the Fed, which is going to make it hard for them to get inflation down to 2.0%, which is why we are a bit more concerned that inflation might remain a bit higher for longer as we move into the new year. So wrapping up, what is the bottom line? South Carolina's economy remained very strong and resilient throughout 2024. We have now readjusted towards more stable and sustainable growth patterns, moving away from the pandemic era bubble. That correction period is largely behind us, and we're in a position to be able to move forward towards more stable growth in 2025. And again, all metrics point to a year of fairly steady growth. Again, no red flags. We are much more optimistic that we avoid recession in 2025. The biggest risk factor, as I mentioned, inflation. It may rebound this year. We anticipate, or we expect that there's about a 50% chance, a 50-50 chance that inflation may rebound. And just to be clear, when we talk about inflation rebounding, I'm not trying to imply that we're going to see inflation go back to anything that we saw several years ago or closer to the pandemic. All we mean by that is that inflation has about a 50% chance of changing course and starting to tick back upwards towards 3%, rather than continuing its downward trajectory towards 2%. Remember, inflation right now is at 2.7. So we're basically just talking about a change in the direction of inflation in 2025. That's what we're talking about, that 50-50 risk being. And why does that matter? It matters because it can influence where the Federal Reserve takes us with respect to interest rates. We do anticipate that the Fed will likely lower interest rates by up to 50 basis points this year. That is in line with what they have published as their intent. I think it's likely they will follow through on that. Any further rate cuts, however, will primarily depend on the path of inflation and just how sticky it is at around 2.5%. Again, do we see it continue to drop towards 2%, or do we see it rebound and start to move higher towards 3%? So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Bill and be happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Dr. Von Essen. So many takeaways there, great nuggets. Thank you very, very much. And we do have several questions that our listeners have been sending in. And our first question is coming from Tom. And Tom is asking, saying inflation is trending downward, but people are still feeling sticker shock and high prices at the grocery store. And why is this?
Well, that's a great question. And it's because when we look at grocery prices specifically, if we look at food prices, they're up significantly compared to where we were back in on the eve of the pandemic. So if you just look at $100 in groceries, for example, from 2019, so if you went to the grocery store, bought $100 worth of food, of groceries, how much would that cost you today? And the answer is $128. So we've seen food prices rise by about 28% since 2020, which is clearly significant and is a major, major change. And so that's more than the rate of wage growth that we've seen over that same 4-year period. So wage growth, again, on average, has been closer to about 20% across the US. So that's a big difference, 28% versus 20%. And people feel that, and they see that when they go to the grocery store. You see the same thing when you go to the gas station, when you're buying things online or at the store. Or you're going to Amazon, for example. So prices have been rising faster than wages. People feel that. And so that's why consumer sentiment has been so low. But it's also why it's important for us to continue to see in 2025 wages grow faster than inflation. As I mentioned, in 2024, we hit a real pivotal point where inflation dropped below the rate of wage growth. So wages are now rising faster than prices. So consumers are clawing back some of that lost purchasing power. Again, they haven't clawed it all back yet. So prices have still risen more than wages have when we look in total over the last 4 to 5 years or so. But we're moving in the right direction. And that's really what's likely to continue in 2025. And that's what makes us more optimistic about the economy, despite the fact that consumers, again, are still struggling with these high prices.
Thank you. Janice is asking, how do new administrations tend to impact the economy, especially in Q1 and Q2?
So I think, so a couple of ways to address that. I think number one, and overall, when we look at presidential administrations, they tend not to have a major influence on the economy in the long run. So if we look over a period of years, for example, but they can influence things in the short run, particularly on the margin. So one example of that is we've seen a significant uptick in business confidence since the election. So particularly small business confidence, and so that's a very good thing as we move into 2025, and that's largely because of anticipated changes in the regulatory environment and the potential for lower taxes. So lower taxes and less regulation, which is good news for overall businesses. So it's generated a sizable increase in business sentiment. And then the other factor, though, is going back to that risk of inflation. And I think when we look at what types of new policies might be introduced this year, tariffs are certainly on President-elect Trump's agenda. And so the question will be, what type of tariffs are implemented and how does that impact overall price levels? Again, is that going to create a recession? No, but it can impact certain industry sectors and affect price levels as well. So we've got kind of positives and negatives when we look at the overall economic outlook. So those would be, I think, the two biggest pieces that we want to consider as we look ahead to the spring months.
Thank you. Wade is asking if you expect the economy to move from the B plus to an A minus or A category.
Great question. I think that is very likely. Yes, I think that the key, remember, what is it that's keeping us from an A? That lost purchasing power, that's what's keeping us from an A. The fact that overall, consumers are still worse off today than they were in 2020. Because prices, if you look over the last 4 years, and going back to the eve of the pandemic in December of 2019, the average consumer has seen prices rise faster than wages. So they have lost purchasing power. Their dollar's not going as far. But in 2025, if we continue to see wage growth at around 4%, where it is today, and we continue to see inflation that remains below 3%, then wages are going to continue to grow faster than prices, right? Because of that difference. And so over time, we'll begin to see consumers claw back that lost purchasing power. And we anticipate that in 2025, they will recapture all of their lost purchasing power. So this time next year, we hope to be able to say that when you compare where the average consumer is in January of 2026 to where they were in December of 2019, they are better off from a purchasing power standpoint. I think that scenario is likely. And if that comes to pass, then our economy would be performing at an A level in a way that it's not today.
Justin is asking, what's the biggest influencer of wage growth?
Great question. So productivity is the major factor, and that's where we see. So there are two ways that wages can go up. Number one is you can have a higher level of demand. So if you've got if there's just a higher demand for a position or an occupation, right? Employers are going to pay more to attract and retain those workers. Or you can have those existing workers that are more productive. In other words, they're producing more in a given period of time. And it's the latter that we really want to see. We want to see more productivity gains. That's where we see the biggest increase in wages. And the good news is we have begun to see more productivity gains in the last year. That's another trend that has emerged. We expect that to continue as we see AI and incorporated more into the workspace. And so there are a lot of technologies that are still in their infancy, but are rapidly improving. And so we expect for productivity growth to continue to rise, and that's going to help wage gains, certainly this year and over the next several years.
The next is a comment from Fran, and Fran is saying that this is fantastic. Would he come back for a mid-year checkup?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to do it. And I think that things are changing so quickly that it's important to keep our pulse on what's going on. But we do anticipate a positive year in 2025. Again, more stable growth, moving away from that pandemic bubble into this new era. So we're excited and optimistic about 2025. But again, keep your eye on inflation. That's the big wild card. So we'll see how that turns out. But yes, absolutely happy to join you all for a mid-year update to refresh and continue to look ahead to the second half of the year and even into 2026 at that point.
One last question for you here. We have several others, but don't have time for them. But just one last question, and this is coming in from Allison. And Allison is asking, how do you see the aging population of our country impacting our economy with healthcare as well as the transfer of wealth? I thought with our population and things here that needed to get that question in.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a lot of factors that are at play there that the aging demographics are going to impact. I would say for South Carolina and for the coastal regions especially, one of the things that means is that we're going to see more demand for housing, more demand for healthcare. Both sectors are likely to be drivers for the state's economy, and especially in the coastal region as we move forward. Because you have to remember that the coastal regions of South Carolina are, in a sense, getting a kind of a double whammy, for lack of a better term. We've got more people moving in of all ages. So in general, we have people moving in to South Carolina and to the coastal regions from all over the country. And that's likely to continue. We're going to see more growth in the southeastern United States than any other region of the country over the next 2 decades. So you got that, you've got one piece just from general migration patterns. And then you've got the aging of the population, which the questioner alluded to. And that means that a lot of the people moving in are going to be older. So in both cases, that means a surge in demand for healthcare. Healthcare has been the biggest driver for South Carolina's economy overall in the past 2 years. And I anticipate that continuing for the foreseeable future because of both of those trends, especially with respect to the demographic shifts. And then the second piece that the demographic shift is going to affect in South Carolina is our need for workers. This labor shortage that we're experiencing now is not going away. It has tapered some in the last year, but overall, employers are going to continue to struggle to find workers in South Carolina for the foreseeable future. That is not going to be something that goes away in 2025, and it's because the primary reason for the lack of workers is that we've seen so many baby boomers retire. And that has created a big hole in the labor market. So that's going to be another challenge that businesses face as we move forward.
Dr. Von Essen, thank you so much for your time today, your knowledge, and sharing it with us and all of our listeners.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you, Bill. It's great to see everybody this morning. Thank you again.
We'll see you soon. Take care.
All right, you guys have a great day.
All right, we'll shift now to talking a little bit about beach renourishment. And you may or may not know that about every decade or so, Hilton Head Island undergoes beach renourishment, and that's critical to maintaining our beaches, our quality of life, and also our property values. And thankfully, it's paid for primarily by our visitors. And to tell us about that, I'm excited to welcome Heather Woolwine. Heather's Hilton Head Island's new communications director. She has over 20 years of experience in public relations and communications, and most recently at the Medical University of South Carolina before joining the team at Hilton Head Island Town Hall. Heather's off to a stellar start, ensuring that our residents stay informed about what's happening on the island and many other things. So Heather, we're glad to have you with us today and look forward to your beach renourishment update.
Good morning, Bill, and thank you so much for having me. It's been an amazing 4 months since I arrived just after Labor Day in September, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with everybody this morning. As you all can imagine, some specifics are still very much in the works, but I will do my best today to share with you very briefly what I do know, where you and our residents and visitors can find more information as things progress. And then, of course, how this project is so much more than just moving a little bit of sand around. So let me start with a really important message that, frankly, we'll need your help as a group in carrying this forward throughout the project. And that's that our beaches are open and they're going to remain open as the project moves forward. Now you're going to start seeing signs that we're getting ready to move on beach renourishment in the March-April timeframe. So you'll see equipment, materials arriving, things like that at various locations. And then we're going to roll the project out in 3 phases, so 3 general phases. Phase 1 is going to take place from June of 2025 through October 2025. And that phase 1 is going to really be about the heel. So Port Royal, Fish Hall, Pine Island, those locations. Phase 2, which will commence around September of 2025. So really after that high season mark and continue through May 2026. That'll be the Central Island, South Beach area. And then finally, phase 3, those are the Pine Island structures. And our timing on that is still to be determined. So we'll keep you up to date, of course, as we know more. And I want everybody to know, as I'm having conversations around here with the folks in charge of this project, I can tell you there is a huge commitment to minimizing the amount of beach that'll be restricted at any given time. So I think that's already evidenced, right, by phase 2 and what's in phase 2, you know, keeping those central and southern shorelines largely unaffected until the fall season of 2025. And then the project is designed to be as non-disruptive as possible. So that's approximately 1,000 feet or 2% of the 12 miles of beach that would be restricted at any given time. The group is also really, really focused on minimizing any sort of inconvenience or challenge. As many of you know, this is not Hilton Head Island's first rodeo when it comes to beach renourishment. This will be our fifth since 1990. And a lot of lessons have been learned along the way. And the good thing about that is we get an opportunity to implement those. Any negative impact, for flora, fauna, everything in this beautiful island oasis, we're also working really hard to minimize that as well. So working with our friends at the Sea Turtle Patrol and other organizations to make sure that, we're doing everything that we can to minimize, again, that impact to our natural environment. We're also committed to a comprehensive ongoing communication process, and that's for the duration of the 3 phases of the project. So the bottom line there is that when we know, you're going to know too. And what does that look like? So some of you may have already seen we're starting to talk a little bit in the media about beach renourishment and what that means for folks. So we can start planning. There have been some snail mail letter campaigns and email blasts that have already started to move this month. There's going to be a ton of robust information on the website. In fact, there's already an interactive map there, great timeline, descriptions of what the project, the different pieces of the project and how they work together. You could sign up there on the website for beach renourishment updates, just specific updates about that. We're going to include updates in our biweekly newsletter, so a plug for that. If you haven't signed up for that, please do. Of course, our Facebook page will carry updates. And then if you haven't already, one of the things that I was really excited about when I first moved here 4 months ago was the My HHI app. So not only can you get beach renourishment updates through that app, but it's kind of a great one-stop shop for a lot of different things, reporting concerns or maintenance issues or things that you see that the town is doing well. It's a great feedback mechanism. We're also happy to come and speak with specific groups, especially as more details become available and as the project progresses in certain areas, we'll start to see their impacts. We're happy to come and do Q&A sessions. So a few minutes ago, I said that an important message was that our beaches will remain open. And Bill has alluded to this as well. A second one is how this project will be funded. And that's through our Beach Preservation Fund. So shout out to all of our millions of visitors annually who help fill that fund. Our capital improvement program. And then we're also going to be able to use some additional funding from FEMA to help cover the project costs. And then finally, a third important message that I want you to carry with you today is that this project really connects us all back to a very important purpose. And that's one of our core values as a town of environmental sustainability. So no matter who you are, whether you're a resident, visitor, business owner, we all recognize that these beaches have to be preserved, they have to be protected, and that they're a cherished asset. So whether you're talking about the local economy or simply nature itself, we depend on the ongoing vitality of these spaces. And the town's role at this point is really to carry out the community's collective dedication to this core value. And it's through that investment and restoration and maintenance of these wonderful beaches. So as we embrace that role for a 5th time since 1990, we are asking for your understanding, your cooperation, and helping educate residents and visitors alike about the process and what they can expect. And of course, always asking for your patience. So with that, just a thank you again for the chance to share this with all of you today. And I'm happy to answer questions as best I can.
Heather, thank you. And it's been a fast 4 months for you and a whirlwind, but you're certainly off to a great start. You've answered several of the questions that we've had, from funding to timing and others. And thank you for not bearing the headline in the beginning that our beaches are open and will remain open. But this one question here that we have and is coming from Marty, and it probably won't surprise you, but is wondering about if the beaches will remain open for dogs, and if their dogs, people's dogs, will continue to have access to the beach.
So as of right now, I have no reason to think otherwise. There may be certain, during the project itself, there may be times where certain areas are restricted to people and animals, but the plan and moving forward is to maintain as much of our current sort of operation as possible.
Heather, we'll have you back on as we get closer to that June timeframe for more updates, and we look forward to being a partner with you and helping to get the messaging out.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we do always appreciate the Chamber's role and support in beach renourishment projects.
All right, Heather, thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure now to welcome Josh Gruber to Power Hour. Josh is the newly appointed city manager for Hardeeville. Josh knows our region very, very well. He was most recently served as the deputy town manager for the town of Hilton Head Island. And we all know that Hardeeville is experiencing tremendous growth, and including the arrivals of Buc-ee's. Josh's leadership is going to be the key to navigating that growth. And Josh, first of all, congratulations on your new job. I think maybe you're about 69 days into it, if my math was correct. And I know you're a busy guy, and we appreciate you staying on with us today and talking a little bit about the growth and Buc-ee's and other things before you have to move on to your meeting.
Yes, Bill, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be able to speak to this group once again. And you're right, it's been about 69 days. It's been the fastest 69 days that I can recall in a long time, primarily because there are just so many great and exciting things that are going on here in Hardeeville. And so appreciate the opportunity to cover some of those. Let me go ahead and get this fired up. All right, so looking at the city of Hardeeville, we are primed for the future. And I want to talk about some of our current priorities and how those impact not only our city, but also the region as a whole. And so first thing that the city is looking at as one of our high priorities is helping to create new and well-paying jobs within the Hardeeville community. And to support that, we've got a number of really exciting projects going on. One of the ones I want to talk about is SALT, so the South Atlantic Logistics Terminal. Just a couple weeks ago, right before the holidays, we were able to celebrate the groundbreaking of this 880-acre economic development site located along Highway 17 in Hardeeville. This development is going to create up to 6 million square feet of warehouse and industrial space. It represents a capital investment within this site of approximately $200 million, and at full build out is going to create 550 new full-time jobs. Similarly, we've also got a really exciting project with regards to Riverport and a new Exit 3 that is going to be built along I-95. And so you can see on the left-hand side is kind of the plan for this development. It covers a very large piece of ground. I think when you add up all those parts and pieces, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5,000 acres. And so a lot of really great opportunities that are going to come about associated with this new Exit 3. Some of which are going to include additional warehousing and industrial space. This is the portion of the Riverport development that is furthest to the south along Highway 17. And again, at build out of this particular phase of Riverport, it's going to create 200 new jobs. We also have Clarius. That is another industrial warehousing and manufacturing site that is located in the southern portions of Hardeeville. Again, some wonderful opportunities to bring in high-paying both warehousing and manufacturing jobs to this particular location. In terms of pursuing economic development in our downtown area. And if most of you are going, I didn't know that Hardeeville had a downtown area. Well, you're right. We don't really have one yet, but one of our goals is to help create that area. And so along White Hardy Boulevard, which is just off of Exit 5, we have just started a really ambitious project that is going to look at completely redeveloping this corridor and hopefully be able to create into a dynamic commercial and community amenity that combines not only the true look and feel of a downtown area, but creates a public gathering space so that all residents within the Hardeeville community will have a place to come and be a part of a unified community, not just within their individual residential communities that are scattered throughout the city. And so we're really excited about this opportunity. Creates an area that is hopefully going to be welcoming, but also commercially dynamic and sustainable with local businesses, small mom and pop organizations, but an opportunity that's going to hopefully attract people to come to this area to be able to experience that true downtown feel. And then, as you mentioned, Bill, Buc-ee's. We are really excited about the announcement that was made a couple weeks ago that Buc-ee's will be locating at the new Exit 8 interchange off of I-95. This has been something that both the city and the state have been in discussions with Buc-ee's for quite some time. It is going to be Buc-ee's largest product that they offer. And so in terms of its size, it is going to be very significant. And not only does this development call for the Buc-ee's itself, but it also calls for a number of out parcels around Buc-ee's. And so this area, which is just on the north side of the Exit 8 interchange, is going to be changing over the next couple of years. But what's really great about this is because the state and city have been in conversations with Buc-ee's for several years now, revisions to the interchange that are going to be done as part of the I-95 widening project have already taken into account the anticipated traffic patterns that will come from installing a Buc-ee's in this area. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute, but again, this is an incredible opportunity for the city. It's going to create at least 200 new jobs. And again, we all know, and we say a little bit jokingly, but Buc-ee's creates some really will-paying jobs. And so we're excited to welcome them into the city and are looking forward to what they're able to bring us in terms of additional economic development that will be attracted here because of their presence. So one of the other things that we're looking at in terms of our priorities is managing and growing our population base. And so, as you can see over the last several years, Hardeeville's population has been increasing significantly. Typically, on average, we're expecting growth in the neighborhood of between 2,000 to 3,000 new residents every year. And that is directly related to the amount of residential development that is going on within the city. And that's translating then into a significant population increase. And so we hear from a lot of different sources that South Carolina is one of the fastest growing areas in the Southeast. And then within South Carolina, Jasper County and particularly Hardeeville are one of the fastest growing areas within the state of South Carolina. And so we're really excited about how this is going to help transform our community, what we're going to be able to come in the future. But we know that we're no longer Sleepy Little Hardeeville anymore. We're going to be growing quite quickly into a major metropolitan area. So in looking at that increase in population, we have to have a place for those people to live. And so we have significantly increased the amount of housing that's available over the last several years. And this trend, as you can see in this slide that we're processing this year alone, we just wrapped up our year-end figures. And for 2024, we were right under 1,500 new single-family residential permits that were issued this year. And so with that kind of growth, we're likely to see that sustaining into the future. Where that growth is occurring is across a number of different active communities. The largest you can see is currently Margaritaville, but just behind it is Sun City on the west side and on the north side of East Argent Boulevard, the Cottages, Riverton Point. There's a number of great communities. And as you see in this map, those communities are really in all locations across the city. And so depending upon what type of product you may be looking for, whether it's entry level, mid-level, or even higher end, we've got a product for you within our community. And so we're excited about how that's going to bring new residents to this community. And our goal is to be able to offer them all of the amenities that they will need in order to have their needs met within the city. So shopping, dining, recreation, that is all things that we are focused on bringing to this community in order to support the new residents that are coming here. In addition to seeing a lot of commercially available and market priced products, the city's also been working on making improvements within our affordable housing. And so this is a picture of a new development that the city helped create in a public-private partnership with Habitat for Humanity and Farino Home Builders. Essentially, the city was able to acquire some land, and that land was provided to Farino, who built the units that you see here in this picture. And then the units were then worked through Habitat to identify occupants to own those structures and ensure their affordability going forward into the future. In addition to looking at our growing population, we then have to look at its impact to our infrastructure. And so we have a number of active projects that are going on right now to support that increase in population. The largest of which is the I-95 widening program. So that's been in the works for several years now, but it is just getting ready to kick off this calendar year. And it's going to start at the Georgia border and go all the way up to mile marker 9, so just north of exit 8, which is the exit for Bluffton and Hilton Head Island. And so you can see that that's going to be a fairly substantial project that they're going to be undertaking. Not only does it include the 3 exits, so the construction of new exit 3, the modifications at exit 5, and the modifications at exit 8, but from where the project is going to start at the Georgia border to where it's going to go at exit 9, there's actually 14 different bridges that are going to be involved as part of this widening and renovation project. So we're really excited to see that kick off because of what it's going to entail, not only for traffic movements through the city, but also in terms of opening up new commercial opportunities through that corridor. In addition, Jasper County was successful in passing a transportation sales tax referendum during the 2024 elections. So that's going to provide a 1% sales tax over the next 15 years, which is going to generate about $470 million. Of that, we've got targeted improvements that are going to be done on 462, Argent Boulevard, US 278, SC 170, 315, 46, and then the widening at US 17. So some really substantial and impactful projects that hopefully will be able to come about in easing traffic congestion, making transportation through the city safer and easier, and ultimately helping to provide additional capacity that as the city continues to grow, we have the infrastructure that's in place to support that. We're also going to be continuing to work with our partners in Beaufort County and at the state to look at areas that are outside of Jasper County, but are still within portions of the city of Hardeeville. And so one of those is the Triangle Project. That looks at Argent Boulevard, 278 and 170. Obviously, those are major transportation corridors, both within the city and within Beaufort County. And so we're continuing to work with them on how we can look at the improvements that are needed in this area, understanding that Beaufort County's referendum was not successful, but starting to talk about what alternatives might be available either at the county or state level to ensure that the needs that are present within this area will ultimately be addressed sufficiently. In going back and looking at those improvements that I mentioned as part of the I-95 widening project, and again, understanding that the designs that you're seeing here, and this is what the DOT calls a converging diamond. This is their preferred alternative to address not only traffic congestion through this particular area, but again, taking into account the future traffic that's going to be coming as a result of Buc-ee's locating at this exit. And the goal of this was to ensure that if a motorist was traveling on I-95 and they wanted to hop off the interstate in order to be able to grab a breakfast sandwich or a drink or some beaver nuggets, they could be able to get off the interstate, get to Buc-ee's, and get back on the interstate without having to go outside of this corridor. And so this converging diamond pattern that you see here is what's going to be put in place both at exit 8 and at the new exit 3 in order to hopefully accommodate the traffic volumes that are going to be expected to go through there. I also mentioned improvements to exit 5. That's going to help put in a couple of traffic lights that are at the exit and entrance points of the interchange there. It's also going to create a new frontage road that will hopefully go back behind some of the commercial businesses and take some of the traffic congestion off of Highway 17, particularly when we look at some of the tractor trailer traffic that we're seeing coming through that area. We want to make sure it's safe for everybody to go through that corridor. And so putting in a roundabout and a new frontage road that will ultimately connect to the entrance ramp to I-95 are part of this planned improvement. I mentioned exit 3. Again, this is where Riverport's going to go, and they're going to look at doing the converging diamond as a part of building this new interchange that currently does not exist. We're also continuing to support educational and workforce training efforts. So not only do we want to create new jobs for people in the Hardeeville area, but we want to be able to create qualified workers that can then fill those new jobs. And so the city's had a longstanding partnership with entities like the Technical College of the Lowcountry. We also support a workforce training program and recently graduated 150 CDL and welding graduates who are now in our local workforce. And so we're excited to continue that partnership and further our development of qualified workforce to meet the growing needs here in Hardeeville. And then lastly, with all of this growth that's going to go on, I mentioned wanting to be able to provide for our residents and the quality of life that we want. And in doing so, our goal is to be able to create a really not self-contained, but a self-providing community that if you want to go out and have your retail, shopping, and entertainment and recreational needs met, you will be able to do that all within Hardeeville rather than having to travel to other communities to have those needs met. And so those are all areas that we're continuing to focus on and are really excited about what the future holds for Hardeeville. I think over the next 10 to 20 years, you're going to see us be the epicenter of a lot of a really exciting new growth and development opportunities. And so with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions, but thank you again for the opportunity to speak with everyone this morning.
Josh, terrific information, and you certainly have your work cut out for you.
Yes, sir.
A few questions for you if you still have time.
Absolutely, please.
Great. First one's coming from James, and James is asking if the state and city of Hardeeville looked at other Buc-ee's exits before developing the plan.
Yes, my understanding was there was a number of exploratory meetings and sites that were looked at, but ultimately exit 8 was decided upon as the preferred location. And then because that decision was made a while ago, we've been able to ensure that design efforts have specifically included the impacts that are going to come from locating that business in that particular area.
And then Frank is asking how the converging diamond pattern will help the 278 exit and free up traffic more.
Sure. And Frank, I've got to be honest, I am not an engineer, so I'm not sure that I can speak to that from a technical standpoint, but I can tell you that the engineers that we are working with, both at DOT and in the private sector, are telling us that while this may look a little wonky on paper, the functionality of this design is significantly better in terms of performance than what other alternatives provide. And so this is now what DOT is looking at in terms of the standard for high volume intersections. And so I apologize for not being able to speak to it more specifically than that, but other than to say that based upon what the engineers have looked at, they're telling us this is the best option for us to move forward with.
All right, thank you. And we've had several messages during your presentation about some people not being able to see the PowerPoint. And I was wondering if that's something you could share with us, that we could provide a link out to our listeners that they could go back and
absolutely. My apologies for that. I'll send over the link and we'll be happy to share it. Yes, we're really excited about this information, so we want to make sure that people have access to it.
We will push it out. Next question is coming from Kim, and Kim is asking, what are your plans to provide health care, such as doctors and child care, to support your population growth?
Sure. So we have Navant Health and Coastal Carolina Hospital already within Hardyville. And so we're excited to continue that partnership and have them here within our community. As part of some of the other development opportunities that I mentioned, specifically, I know Exit 3 has a large medical campus component to it that is planned as part of their development efforts. So it will still be likely a couple of years before we start seeing some of these products come online. But within our future plans, we are looking at trying to create more opportunities for medical and healthcare services to meet the demands of the population that are going to be here within the city. When it comes to childcare, I know we're working with some of our other regional partners because that issue is not unique to Hardyville. I don't know that we've got any great answers yet. We know that there's a market demand and need out there, but we're not exactly sure what the solution is other than continuing to work with some of our state representatives on some of the regulatory hurdles that we've heard from people within the community are potentially an impediment or a restriction on them being able to open small businesses that provide healthcare or childcare services. So we know it's a need that needs to be met. We don't have a lot of specific opportunities to address that yet, but it is something we are working on.
Abby is asking if or what the expected date of Bucky's opening is.
So ideally, we're going to have I-95 and the Exit 8 work. We'll cut a ribbon the same day that Bucky's is opening, the same day I-95 widening is complete and the Exit 8 work is complete. So our goal is to have all of that work kind of go on contemporaneously with one another. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that those infrastructure improvements are in place and are fully open before Bucky's goes live with their commercial activities.
All right, thank you. A couple more questions, and before we get you on your way, the next question is coming in from Austin, and Austin is saying, I recently went to a Bucky's in Florida, and as I exited the interstate, it took me 40 minutes to get back on and off, and what are the plans to ensure that this doesn't happen at an already busy Exit 8?
Sure. And that's a very common question we've heard from a number of individuals. And that's why I've been trying to stress that what I believe is different about the Bucky's that's going to go in at this location as compared to some others is the Bucky's that have gone in at other locations are utilizing the existing infrastructure that was already there, potentially without making any retrofits to it. Whereas this is going to be completely redone and designed with the traffic impacts from Bucky's in mind. So it doesn't mean that we're never going to have congestion through that area, but it does mean that we've done everything that we can to try to anticipate and design for traffic improvements in the area that will hope to lessen any of those congestion related impacts.
All right, thank you. You've mostly covered this, but Fred was asking again if there's anything being done to improve traffic on 278 near 95.
Absolutely. So I mentioned as part of the Jasper County sales tax referendum, we have some funds that are put in for that. There's a number of improvements that need to be made on 278. We have some intersection improvements, one at John Smith Road. The new light that they put in at Medical Center Drive is going to be moved a little bit further south to a new interchange that's going to be built in that location. And then ultimately, what we're looking at is widening 278 all the way from I-95 down to the 170 interchange. And so there's a lot of good plans that are in place for improvements to 278. We're just going to have to be patient as we see those come online over the next couple of years.
Josh, thank you so much, and thank you for staying with us today and your impressive presentation. Lots of things to come. We look forward to following it and continuing to look to you and your team to update the region residents and businesses on what's going on.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Bill. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
You do the same. Take care. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder, before we close, I want to remind you of Chamber Wellness Week happening again January the 11th to the 18th. And it all kicks off this Saturday with our Chamber Waves to Wellness 5K at the Tiki Hut down at the Beach House. So for all the details on the wellness deals available and activities that will be going on, please visit chamberwellnessweek.com. Well, hopefully you found the session today as informative as I did. and lots of great takeaways. And we look forward to being back with you next month, sharing more great regional and statewide information. Have a great rest of your week. See you at Chamber Wellness Week.